How did a young nobleman from Burgundy, destined for the arms and honors of the world, become one of the greatest saints of the Middle Ages, an advisor to popes and kings, a reformer of monastic life, and the sweetest singer of the Virgin Mary? Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was all this and much more, a humble monk and a powerful voice of his time, a mystic in love with God, and a man of action who traveled throughout Europe, a profound theologian whose words were so sweet that they earned him the title of the mellifluous doctor, that is, the doctor who distills honey. The Church venerates him as a doctor of the Church and calls him the last of the Fathers because of the depth of his teaching. But above all, Saint Bernard is remembered for his ardent love for the Virgin Mary, to whom he dedicated pages of extraordinary beauty, and whom he taught people to turn to as to the star that guides us through the night. Join me on this journey through his life, his works, and his love for God and his mother as we discover this giant of faith, whose words continue to distill sweetness 8 centuries later. Saint Bernard was born in the year 1090 in the region of Burgundy, France, at Fontaines Castle, near the city of Dijon. He belonged to a family of Burgundy's high nobility and came into the world surrounded by the dignity and privileges that accompanied his station. In that land of France, steeped in Christian tradition, and in that noble household, began the life of the man who would become one of the great saints of the Middle Ages. The House of Fontaines was a noble family of illustrious lineage and a strong sense of honor and Christian faith. Bernard's father, named Tesselin, was a nobleman of Burgundy, a knight-at-arms in the service of his lord, upright and God-fearing. The family enjoyed the prestige and means proper to its station and cultivated the values of the nobility of the time: honor, loyalty, courage in battle, and Christian faith. Bernard was one of several children in a large family. Like him, his siblings were destined by their birth for a military career and the honors of the world. But in time, most of them would follow Bernard along the path of religious life, leaving the world to consecrate themselves to God. Thus, the House of Fontaines would give the Church not only Bernard, but several of its children in a beautiful story of vocations born within a single home. Burgundy at that time was a land of deep Christian life, dotted with churches and monasteries, in an age of great religious fervor and reform within the life of the Church. It was also the time when, precisely in those lands, the Cistercian reform was taking shape. Seeking to renew monastic life, a reform Bernard would join and propel forward with extraordinary force. The environment into which Bernard was born was therefore marked by faith and by a yearning to renew Christian life. Burgundy and the House of Fontaines, the noble birthplace of Saint Bernard, reveal the origins of this great saint. A family of the high nobility, deeply rooted in Christian faith, in a land of religious fervor. From that noble cradle would emerge a man who would abandon the honors of the world to consecrate himself to God. And in his formation, his mother played a decisive role, a holy woman whose example and upbringing profoundly shaped the future saint. Saint Bernard's mother, Aleth of Montbard, played a decisive role in his formation. She was a woman of deep piety and great virtue, whose example and upbringing profoundly shaped the future saint. The figure of Aleth is one of the most beautiful in the family circle of Saint Bernard, and she shows the importance of the mother in transmitting the faith and forming her children. Aleth of Montbard belonged, like her husband, to the high nobility of Burgundy, but she was distinguished above all by her piety and Christian virtues. She was a woman of prayer, charity, and penance, living her faith fervently amid her duties as wife and mother. Despite her noble status, she devoted herself to works of mercy, helped the poor and the sick, and raised her children in the fear of God. Her home was a true school of Christian virtue. Aleth devoted herself diligently to the Christian education of her children, and especially to that of Bernard, in whom she perceived exceptional gifts. She raised them in the love of God, in piety, and in the practice of virtue, sowing the seed of faith in their hearts. Tradition relates that, moved by her piety, Alyth had offered her children to God even before their birth, desiring that they might consecrate themselves to his service. Her Christian education was the foundation upon which Bernard's holiness would be built. Alyth's influence on Bernard was profound and lasting. From his mother, the future saint received his piety, his love of God, and the virtues he would later develop in religious life. Alyth's death, which occurred when Bernard was still young, affected him deeply and was, according to some accounts, one of the factors that moved him to consider more seriously the meaning of his life and his vocation. His holy mother had left an indelible mark on her son's heart. Alyth, the holy mother of Saint Bernard, was therefore a decisive figure in the formation of the future saint. Her piety, virtues, and Christian education sowed the seed of faith and holiness in Bernard's heart. Her example shows the importance of the mother in transmitting the faith and forming her children. On the foundation of this Christian education, Bernard would grow and, in his youth, face the crossroads between the world and God. The young Bernard stood out for his natural gifts and his education, which, in the eyes of the world, destined him for a brilliant career. But in his youth, he had to face a decisive crossroads, the choice between the honors and pleasures of the world, to which his birth and gifts invited him, and God's call to a life of consecration. From this crossroads would emerge his great choice. Bernard was endowed with extraordinary qualities. He was intelligent, eloquent, pleasant in manner, and highly attractive personally. He had been educated in the letters and arts befitting a young nobleman of his time, and showed exceptional gifts for study, speaking, and governance. These qualities, together with his noble birth, opened the doors to a brilliant career in the world. In the military, at court, or in ecclesiastical office, the world had much to offer him. Yet alongside the world's invitations, Bernard felt in his heart God's call to a life of greater dedication. The Christian education he had received from his mother, Alyth's death, and the promptings of grace moved him to consider the meaning of his life and to contemplate leaving the world to consecrate himself to God. In his youth, then, an interior battle was being waged between the attractions of the world and God's call. Tradition relates that, in his youth, Bernard also had to struggle against the temptations proper to his age, and that he emerged victorious from them through his determination and God's grace. Various episodes are told of his struggle for purity, in which Bernard, with firmness and God's help, overcame temptation and kept his heart for God. These victories strengthened his resolve to consecrate himself entirely to the Lord. Bernard's youth, with his gifts and his crossroads, shows us a young man destined, in the eyes of the world, for a brilliant career, yet drawn by God's call to a life of deeper commitment. From this crossroads would come his great choice for God. Instead of using his gifts in the service of the world, he would place them at the service of God and the Church. This choice took concrete form in a clear and firm decision: conversion and the call to monastic life at Citeaux. The great decision of Bernard's life was to leave the world and consecrate himself to God in monastic life by entering Citeaux, the monastery at the heart of the emerging Cistercian reform. This decision, the fruit of his conversion and of God's call, set the course of his entire life and marked the beginning of his journey toward holiness. Bernard's conversion was not a change from sin to grace, for he had always been devout, but rather the passage from a good life to one of total dedication to God. Moved by grace and by his desire to serve God without reserve, Bernard decided to abandon the honors and opportunities the world offered him and embrace the monastic life of poverty, penance, and prayer. It was a radical choice, a giving up of everything for God, befitting a generous soul. Bernard chose Citeaux for his monastic life. At that time, it was the center of a new reform of monastic life, the Cistercian reform, which sought to return to strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict through poverty, austerity, and work. Bernard's choice of Citeaux, a poor and austere monastery, rather than others that were wealthier and more renowned, reveals his desire to embrace a life of greater rigor and more complete dedication to God. He was not seeking comfort, but radical commitment in following Christ. What is most admirable about Bernard's conversion is that he did not convert alone, but drew many others along with him. Such was the power of his example and his words that he succeeded in persuading several of his brothers, some relatives and friends, and other young nobles to embrace monastic life with him. Bernard thus became an apostle of vocations from the very beginning of his journey, drawing others toward God through the strength of his conviction and example. Bernard's conversion and his call to Citeaux mark the beginning of his consecrated life and his journey toward holiness. His radical choice for God and his ability to draw others along with him already reveal the greatness of his soul and the role he was destined to play. Bernard was leaving the world, but not alone. He was accompanied by a group of companions whom he had won for God. With this group of 30 companions, according to tradition, he presented himself at the gates of Citeaux to begin his monastic life. One of the most remarkable episodes at the beginning of Saint Bernard's religious life is that he entered Citeaux not alone, but accompanied by a large group of companions, about 30, according to tradition, whom he had won over to monastic life through the power of his example and his words. This entrance into Citeaux with 30 companions is an eloquent testimony to Bernard's influence and apostolic zeal. Tradition recounts that Bernard, determined to enter Citeaux, did not want to do so alone, but devoted himself to persuading others to accompany him. Through his eloquence, conviction, and example, he succeeded in persuading several of his brothers, some relatives, and various young men to leave the world and embrace monastic life with him. It is said that mothers hid their sons and wives their husbands, fearing that Bernard would draw them into the monastery. Such was the power of his words. Thus, around the year 1113, Bernard appeared at the gates of Citeaux, accompanied by that large group of companions, and together they asked to be admitted to the monastery. The arrival of such a large group, led by a young man of such remarkable gifts, was a notable event for Citeaux, which at the time was a poor monastery with few monks. Bernard and his companions arrived like a blessing for the fledgling community. The abbot of Citeaux at that time was Saint Stephen Harding, one of the founders of the Cistercian reform, who joyfully welcomed Bernard and his companions. Citeaux, which was facing difficulties and had few monks, thus received an extraordinary boost with the arrival of that large and fervent group. Bernard's entry marked the beginning of a new era for Citeaux and for the entire Cistercian reform, which Bernard would decisively advance. Bernard's entry into Citeaux with 30 companions was therefore an eloquent testimony to his influence and apostolic zeal from the very beginning of his religious life. He did not become a monk alone. He drew many others along with him, giving Citeaux an extraordinary boost. His entry marked the beginning of a new era for the Cistercian reform, and to understand the scope of Bernard's work, it is helpful to know the fledgling Citeaux that he joined and the reform of monasticism it represented. To understand the work of Saint Bernard, it is helpful to know the fledgling Citeaux that he joined and the reform of monastic life that the monastery represented. Citeaux was the center of a movement to renew monastic life, the Cistercian reform, which sought to return to strict and pure observance of the rule of Saint Benedict, and which Bernard would decisively advance. Monastic life, which had begun centuries earlier, had reached great splendor, but over time it had become lax in some places, departing from the rigor and purity of its origins. Some monasteries had grown wealthy and observance of the rule had become less strict. In response to this laxity, reform movements arose that sought to return to strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict, to the poverty, austerity, and work that had characterized the early days. Citeaux was the center of one of these reform movements. Founded shortly beforehand by a group of monks eager to live the rule of Saint Benedict in all its purity, Citeaux sought a monastic life of poverty, austerity, manual labor, silence, and prayer, withdrawn from the world and its riches. The Cistercian monks lived simply and austerely in poor monasteries, devoted to prayer and to the work of their hands, in accordance with the ideal of the rule. The Cistercian reform thus represented a return to the sources of monastic life, to the purity and rigor of its origins. It sought an authentic monastic life, free from the laxity that had arisen in some places, and faithful to the ideal of Saint Benedict. Bernard joined this reform, drawn precisely by its rigor and authenticity, and would give it extraordinary momentum, becoming its most celebrated and influential figure. The fledgling Citeaux and the reform of monasticism it represented thus provide the context for St. Bernard's work. Bernard joined this reform, which sought to return to the purity of monastic life and would give it decisive impetus. His entry into Citeaux marked the beginning of a new era for the Cistercian reform, and very soon, given his ability and gifts, Bernard would be sent to found a new monastery, which would become the center of his life and work. Clairvaux. Shortly after entering Citeaux, in view of his ability, fervor, and gifts for leadership, Bernard was sent, while still very young, to found a new monastery in a solitary valley that would come to be known as Clairvaux. This foundation, established in the year 1115, marked the beginning of Bernard's great work, for Clairvaux would be the center of his life and influence for nearly 40 years. Around the year 1115, the abbot of Citeaux, Saint Stephen Harding, sent Bernard, together with a group of monks, to found a new monastery, in keeping with the order's custom of sending groups of monks to establish new houses. Although very young, Bernard was placed at the head of the group as abbot of the new foundation. The chosen site was a solitary and rugged valley, which the monks cleared and cultivated, giving it the name Clairvaux, meaning clear valley or luminous valley. The beginnings of Clairvaux were extremely difficult. The monks had to work arduously to clear the land, build the monastery, and make the solitary valley fit for cultivation. They lived in great poverty and austerity, enduring hunger, cold, and hardship in a life of extreme rigor. As abbot, Bernard shared in, and even surpassed, the penances of his monks, setting an example of austerity and dedication. The early years of Clairvaux were a school of penance and faith. Despite its difficult beginnings, Clairvaux grew and flourished until it became one of the most renowned and influential monasteries in Christendom. Bernard's reputation for holiness and the fervor of the community attracted numerous young men who came to Clairvaux to embrace the monastic life. The monastery filled with monks, and groups later departed from it to found new houses, spreading the Cistercian reform throughout Europe. Clairvaux became a great spiritual center. The foundation of Clairvaux in the year 1115 thus marked the beginning of Saint Bernard's great work. That solitary valley, cleared and cultivated by the monks amid great hardship, became one of the great spiritual centers of Christendom and the center of Bernard's life and influence. At the head of that monastery stood Bernard, the young abbot, whose rigor, penance, and zeal would shape the life of the community. At the head of Clairvaux stood Bernard, the young abbot, whose rigor, penance, and zeal shaped the life of the community in its early years. The figure of Bernard as abbot, especially at the beginning, is that of a man of extreme austerity and great fervor, who devoted himself without reserve to forming his community and seeking perfection. In the early years of Clairvaux, Bernard led a life of extreme austerity and penance, to the point of damaging his health. He fasted rigorously, slept little, practiced severe penances, and also demanded great austerity from his monks. His fervour was so great that in his zeal for perfection he sometimes exceeded proper measure, to the point that he later had to moderate his rigour, both toward himself and in his dealings with his monks, learning to unite high standards with discretion. Over time, Bernard matured both as an abbot and as a guide of souls. He learned to moderate his rigour and to treat his monks with greater discretion and gentleness, adapting to each one and seeking the good of every soul. From a rigour that was sometimes excessive at the beginning, he grew into a wisdom of governance that united high standards with understanding and firmness with tenderness. He thus became a wise and beloved spiritual father, guiding his monks along the paths of God. Bernard's zeal for the perfection of his community and for the glory of God was ardent. He devoted himself to forming his monks, preaching and governing the monastery, all without neglecting his intense life of prayer and union with God. Under his rule, Clairvaux became a school of holiness, from which numerous saints emerged and many other monasteries were founded. Bernard's zeal was the soul of that fruitfulness. The young abbot, with his rigour, penance and zeal, thus shaped the life of Clairvaux in its early years. His extreme austerity, later moderated by discretion, and his zeal for perfection made Clairvaux a school of holiness. Under his governance, the monastery flourished and became a great spiritual centre. The life of that community was shaped by the Cistercian ideal of prayer, work and silence, which is worth knowing. The life of Clairvaux and of the Cistercian monasteries was shaped by the ideal of the Cistercian reform, consisting of prayer, manual labour, silence and austerity, according to the rule of Saint Benedict, lived out in all its purity. It is worth knowing this ideal in order to understand the setting in which Saint Bernard lived and the spirituality he promoted. At the heart of Cistercian life was prayer, especially liturgical prayer, the celebration of the divine offices, which the monks prayed several times during the day and night, according to the rule. Alongside the liturgical prayer, the monks devoted time to personal prayer, meditation on sacred scripture, and spiritual reading. Cistercian life was above all a life of prayer and of seeking God, directed toward union with Him. Alongside prayer, manual labour held an important place in keeping with the Benedictine ideal of prayer and work. The Cistercian monks worked with their hands, cultivating the land and carrying out the tasks necessary to support the community. Manual labour, highly valued by the Cistercians, was at once a means of sustenance, an exercise in humility and penance, and an opportunity for union with God. Through their work, the Cistercians made solitary valleys flourish, transforming them into cultivated lands. Silence was another essential feature of Cistercian life. The monks observed a rigorous silence, speaking only when necessary, in order to foster recollection and union with God. Exterior silence fostered interior silence, the stilling of the passions and the noises of the soul, which makes it possible to hear the voice of God. Alongside silence, Cistercian life was marked by austerity, poverty, and simplicity in clothing, food, and buildings, in keeping with the ideal of returning to the purity of the origins. Cistercian life, consisting of prayer, work, and silence, was therefore the setting in which Saint Bernard lived and the spirituality he promoted. This ideal of returning to the purity of monastic life caused holiness to flourish at Clairvaux and in the Cistercian monasteries. Under Bernard's impetus, this way of life spread throughout Europe through the foundation of numerous monasteries. And precisely the expansion of the order under Bernard's impetus was one of the most notable fruits of his work. One of the most notable fruits of Saint Bernard's work was the extraordinary expansion of the Cistercian order under his impetus. Numerous groups of monks left Clairvaux and the other Cistercian monasteries to found new houses, so that the order spread rapidly throughout Europe, reaching an astonishing number of monasteries. Bernard was the great driving force behind this expansion. Under Bernard's impetus, the Cistercian order experienced extraordinary growth. From the monastery of Clairvaux alone, numerous groups of monks went out to found new houses, which in turn founded others, in an astonishing multiplication. It is said that during Bernard's lifetime more than 300 Cistercian monasteries were founded, many of them directly or indirectly connected with Clairvaux. The order spread through France, Germany, Italy, Spain, England and other countries, covering Europe with monasteries. This expansion was not merely numerical but spiritual as well. The Cistercian monasteries were schools of holiness, from which came numerous saints, bishops, and even a pope who had been a monk of Clairvaux. The Cistercian reform, driven by Bernard, renewed monastic life and contributed to the spiritual renewal of the church and the society of his time. Through their life of prayer and work, the Cistercians were a leaven of renewal throughout Christendom. The influence of Clairvaux and Bernard on this expansion was decisive. Bernard was the soul of the order, its most famous and influential figure, and his reputation for holiness attracted numerous young men to the Cistercian life. From Clairvaux, Bernard guided and encouraged the monasteries that depended on it, and his influence extended throughout the order. Although he was not the order's superior general, he was in fact its most influential figure, and his impetus was decisive for its expansion. The expansion of the Cistercian order, with more than 300 monasteries founded during Bernard's lifetime, was therefore one of the most remarkable fruits of his work. Under his impetus, the Cistercian reform spread throughout Europe, renewing monastic life and contributing to the renewal of the Church. But Bernard was not only a great organizer and reformer, he was also a profound teacher and mystic, whose doctrine earned him a place among the great teachers of the Church, as well as a title expressing the sweetness of his words, the mellifluous doctor. Saint Bernard received from tradition a title that wonderfully expresses the character of his words and doctrine, the mellifluous doctor, that is, the doctor who distills honey, whose words are sweet as honey. This title, given to him by the Church, reflects the beauty, sweetness and unction of his preaching and writings, which have delighted and nourished souls for centuries. Bernard's words possessed a singular sweetness and beauty. His sermons and writings, filled with beautiful images, quotations from sacred scripture, and an ardent love of God, captivated those who heard or read them. His eloquence was not empty or merely ornamental, but words that sprang from a heart in love with God and conveyed the sweetness of spiritual experience. His words delighted, but above all they edified and kindled the love of God. The sweetness of Bernard's words sprang from the depth of his spiritual life. He did not speak from hearsay, but from what he had experienced in his own soul, in his relationship with God. His doctrine was not merely speculative theology, but a theology born of prayer and mystical experience, communicating the sweetness of God's love. For this reason, his words touched hearts and moved them to love, uniting the depth of doctrine with the unction of piety. The title, Mellifluous Doctor, therefore expresses this quality of Bernard's words, sweet as honey, beautiful yet profound, capable of delighting and edifying and of kindling the love of God. His works, especially his sermons, have been read and meditated upon for centuries, nourishing the spiritual life of countless souls. The sweetness of his words has made Bernard one of the most beloved teachers of Christian spirituality. The mellifluous doctor, with the sweetness of his words, is therefore one of the great teachers of the Church. His words, sweet and profound, born of prayer and mystical experience, have nourished souls for centuries. This quality of his doctrine, together with its depth, has earned him a distinguished place among the great doctors. And not only that, the Church has given him an even more significant title, placing him in the line of the great teachers of Christian antiquity, that of the last of the Fathers of the Church. Saint Bernard has received from tradition a title that places him in the line of the great teachers of Christian antiquity, that of the last of the Church Fathers. This title expresses the very high esteem in which the Church holds his doctrine, and presents him as a kind of bridge between the age of the Fathers and that of the great scholastic theologians who would come afterward. The Church Fathers are the great teachers of the faith from the first centuries, whose doctrine enjoys special authority in the Church because of their antiquity, holiness, and depth. They are generally regarded as marking the close of the patristic era, the age of the great Fathers. Saint Bernard, although he lived much later in the Middle Ages, is considered by tradition the last of the Fathers, because of the resemblance between his doctrine and that of the ancient Fathers, as well as his exceptionally high spiritual authority. Bernard resembled the ancient Fathers in his way of doing theology. His doctrine was not merely speculative and systematic theology, like that of the later scholastics, but monastic theology, born of meditation on sacred scripture, prayer and spiritual experience, and directed toward union with God. In this respect, he resembled the Fathers, who did theology from lived faith and contemplation rather than from pure reasoning. That is why he is considered the last representative of that way of doing theology. Bernard also lived at a time of transition. After him, scholastic theology would develop with its more systematic and speculative method characteristic of the universities. In a certain sense, Bernard represents the culmination of monastic and patristic theology before the rise of scholasticism. He is, so to speak, a bridge between two eras, the last of one age and the witness to a way of doing theology that would later be complemented by another. His figure, therefore, holds a unique place in the history of theology. The title Last of the Church Fathers thus expresses the very high esteem in which the Church holds Saint Bernard's doctrine, as well as its resemblance to that of the great teachers of Christian antiquity. Bernard did theology in the manner of the Fathers, from lived faith, prayer, and spiritual experience. This theology of his found expression in admirable works, among which his treatise on the love of God holds a prominent place. In it, he explains the stages by which the soul rises to perfect love. Among Saint Bernard's works, his treatise on the love of God holds a prominent place. In it, he sets forth his teaching on love, the central theme of his entire spirituality. For Bernard, love is the heart of Christian life, and in this treatise he teaches how the soul rises step by step from imperfect love to the perfect love of God. In his treatise on the love of God, Bernard begins by affirming that the reason and measure for loving God is to love him without reason or measure, that is, to love him for his own sake, seeking nothing other than him, with a love that knows no limits. God is worthy of infinite love, and the soul is called to love him with its whole being. Love of God is the response to the love that God has shown us first, by giving himself for us. Bernard then describes the stages by which the soul rises in love. In the first stage, a person loves himself for his own sake, with a love that is still selfish. In the second stage, he loves God, but for the benefit he receives from him, that is, out of self-interest. In the third stage, he loves God for God's own sake, no longer out of self-interest, but because of his goodness. And in the fourth and highest stage, a person loves himself only for God's sake. That is, he forgets himself and is wholly lost in the love of God. These stages describe the soul's journey toward perfect love. The fourth degree, perfect love, in which the soul forgets itself and is lost in God, is the summit of the spiritual life, attained in this life only imperfectly and fleetingly, and fulfilled fully in heaven. In it, the soul loves God above all things, and even to the point of forgetting itself, united with him in love. Bernard thus teaches that the goal of the Christian life is perfect love of God, toward which the soul ascends by degrees with the help of grace. The treatise on loving God, with its doctrine of the degrees of love, is therefore one of Saint Bernard's most important works and a synthesis of his spirituality centered on love. In it, he teaches how the soul rises from selfish love to perfect love of God, forgetting itself. This doctrine of love, so central to Bernard, is also developed in another of his great works, his sermons on the Song of Songs, which are among the pinnacles of Christian mystical literature. Among St. Bernard's works, his sermons on the Song of Songs occupy a preeminent place. They are a series of homilies in which he comments on this book of sacred scripture, and they are considered one of the pinnacles of Christian mystical literature. In them, Bernard unfolds the full richness of his spiritual doctrine concerning the love of God and the union of the soul with the Word. The Song of Songs is a book of sacred scripture that, in its literal form, is a love poem between a bridegroom and a bride. But Christian tradition has always read it in a spiritual sense, as a song of the love between God and his people, between Christ and the Church, and between Christ and the soul. In his sermons, Bernard follows this spiritual reading, commenting on the song as a song of love between the Word, Christ, and the soul that seeks him and is united with him. In his sermons on the song, Bernard unfolds a rich doctrine of the spiritual life and mystical union with God. He describes the soul's journey as it seeks the Word, longs for him, suffers because of his absence, and rejoices in his presence until it reaches the union of love. He employs the images of the song, the kiss, the embrace, the search for the beloved, to describe the spiritual realities of the soul's union with God. His commentary is extraordinarily beautiful and profound. These sermons were not the product of mere erudition, but of Bernard's mystical experience. He spoke of union with God because he had experienced it in his own soul. For this reason, his commentary on the song possesses a singular authenticity and power. It is not theory, but the testimony of a lived experience. In them, Bernard conveys the sweetness of the love of God and of the soul's encounter with the Word, inviting his listeners and readers to seek this union for themselves as well. The sermons on the Song of Songs are therefore one of Saint Bernard's masterpieces and one of the pinnacles of Christian mysticism. In them, the mellifluous doctor unfolds the full richness of his doctrine on the love of God and on the union of the soul with the Word, with extraordinary beauty and depth born of his own experience. At the heart of this doctrine is the mystical experience of encountering the Word, which Bernard lived and described with great mastery. At the heart of St. Bernard's spiritual doctrine is the mysticism of the soul's encounter and union with the Word, that is, with Christ. Bernard was not merely a doctor who taught about the things of God, but a mystic who had experienced the encounter with the Word in his own soul and described this experience with singular depth and beauty. Bernard taught that the soul is called to union with the Word, to an encounter of love with Christ, in which the soul, purified and adorned with virtues, is united to him as a bride to her bridegroom. This mystical union is the goal of the spiritual life, toward which the soul ascends along the path of purification and love. Bernard describes this journey through the imagery of the Song of Songs and the richness of his own experience. In his writings, Bernard describes the experience of encountering the Word, which he himself had lived. He speaks of the Word's visitation to the soul, of his felt presence and painful absence, of the joy of union and the longing for the presence that has been lost. He describes how the Word comes to the soul not in a tangible way, but spiritually, and how his presence is known by its effects, fervor, love, and the renewal of the soul. His description of this mystical experience is one of the richest in the Christian tradition. Bernard's mysticism is, above all, a mysticism of love. For him, union with the Word is a union of love, an encounter between two loves, the love of God, who gives himself, and that of the soul, which responds. It is not a union that abolishes the distinction between the soul and God, but a union of love in which the two wills become one in desire. This mysticism of love is at the heart of Bernard's spirituality and the goal toward which he directs the entire spiritual life. The mysticism of encountering the Word is therefore at the heart of the spiritual doctrine of Saint Bernard, born of his own experience. Bernard described the union of the soul with Christ, the goal of the spiritual life, with profound insight and beauty, as a union of love. His mystical teaching has nourished countless souls and placed him among the great masters of spirituality. And alongside his love for Christ, another love filled Bernard's heart and made his name famous, his ardent love for the Virgin Mary. If there is one quality for which Saint Bernard is especially known and loved, it is his ardent devotion to the Virgin Mary, to whom he devoted pages of extraordinary beauty and whom he loved with a filial and tender love. Bernard is one of the Church's great singers of the Virgin Mary throughout its history, and his Marian teaching and devotion have nourished the piety of countless faithful. Bernard's love for the Virgin Mary was ardent and tender, the love of a son for his mother. He contemplated her as the Mother of God, full of grace and the most exalted of all creatures, and at the same time as a close and merciful mother to whom he could turn with filial trust. His devotion was not merely doctrinal, but deeply affective, born of a heart enamored of the Virgin. In his sermons and writings about Mary, one can sense the tenderness and fervor of this love. Bernard devoted beautiful sermons and writings to the Virgin Mary, in which he sang of her greatness and privileges and taught people to turn to her with confidence. Among them are his sermons in praise of the Virgin Mother, as well as numerous passages in his other works. In them, Bernard contemplates Mary in the mysteries of her life, sings of her dignity as Mother of God, her purity and humility, and above all, her role as mediatrix and Mother of Mercy, to whom we can turn in all our needs. Bernard's Marian doctrine, though profound, was always balanced and directed toward Christ. He contemplated Mary in relation to her Son as the Mother of Christ and a cooperator in the work of salvation, and taught people to turn to her as a way of reaching Christ. His Marian devotion did not draw people away from Christ, but led them to him, for Mary, to Bernard, is always the mother who brings us to her Son. This balance, united with the tenderness of his love, makes Bernard's Marian doctrine a model. Bernard, enamored of the Virgin Mary, is therefore one of the Church's great singers of the Virgin throughout history. His ardent love and beautiful Marian doctrine have nourished the piety of countless faithful, and from this love for the Virgin sprang some of the most famous and beautiful pages in all Marian literature, including the one in which he invites us to turn to Mary as the star that guides us through the night of the sea of life. Among the most famous and beautiful pages that Saint Bernard dedicated to the Virgin Mary, none is as well known as the one in which he presents her as the star guiding sailors and invites us to turn to Mary amid life's tribulations. This passage, taken from one of his homilies on the Virgin, is one of the most beautiful Marian texts in the entire Christian tradition. In this celebrated passage, Bernard, commenting on the name Mary, which tradition associates with the star of the sea, invites us to contemplate Mary as the star that shines in the night and guides sailors across the sea. He applies this image to the spiritual life, just as a sailor in the midst of a storm looks to the star so as not to lose his way, so the Christian, amid life's tribulations, must look to Mary and invoke her in order not to be shipwrecked. Mary is the star that guides us across life's stormy sea toward the harbor of salvation. Bernard's words in this passage are of unforgettable beauty. He invites us to look to the star and invoke Mary in every tribulation. If the winds of temptation arise, if the reefs of hardship loom, if the waves of pride, ambition, or envy threaten, we must look to the star and invoke Mary. In dangers, anguish, and uncertainty, we must think of Mary, invoke Mary, and follow Mary. With her, we will not be shipwrecked. These words have comforted and guided countless souls. This passage wonderfully expresses Mary's role as guide, refuge, and help to Christians amid life's tribulations. Mary is the star that never goes out, the one who points the way toward Christ, the one who shelters those who turn to her. Bernard teaches us to turn to Mary with confidence in every need, certain of her maternal help. His invitation to look to the star and invoke Mary sums up an entire spirituality of filial trust in the Virgin. Look to the star, invoke Mary. These words of Saint Bernard, one of the most beautiful Marian texts in the tradition, express Mary's role as the star that guides us through the night of the sea of life. Bernard teaches us to turn to Mary with confidence in every tribulation, certain of her help. This passage has nourished the Marian devotion of countless faithful, and it also reveals another aspect of Bernard's Marian doctrine, Mary's role as mediatrix and mother of mercy. In the Marian doctrine of Saint Bernard, a prominent place is given to the teaching on Mary's role as mediatrix of grace and mother of mercy, to whom the faithful can turn with confidence in all their needs. This aspect of Bernard's doctrine has helped spread filial trust in the Virgin and invocation of her as the help of Christians. Bernard taught that Mary, by virtue of her dignity as Mother of God and her union with Christ, exercises a mediating role between God and humanity, obtaining God's graces for them through her intercession. This does not mean that Mary replaces Christ, the one mediator between God and humanity. Rather, united with him and subordinate to him, she intercedes for humanity and obtains graces for them as a mother who has compassion on her children. Bernard taught people to turn to Mary as mediatrix, obtaining God's graces through her intercession. Bernard used beautiful images to express Mary's role. In some passages he compared her to an aqueduct that carries to humanity the graces descending from God, or to the neck that joins the head, which is Christ, to the body, which is the Church. Mary is the channel through which God's graces reach us, the mediatrix who intercedes for us before her Son. These images express confidence in Mary's maternal intercession. Bernard also taught people to turn to Mary as Mother of Mercy, who is moved with compassion for her children and protects them in their needs. He contemplated Mary not as a distant queen, but as a close and merciful mother to whom sinners can turn with confidence, certain of her intercession. He encouraged the faithful to place all their trust in Mary, to turn to her in times of tribulation, and to invoke her as their help and refuge. His teaching fostered a filial trust in the Virgin as mediatrix and mother of mercy. This is how the Marian doctrine of Saint Bernard presents her, teaching people to turn to her with filial confidence in all their needs. This teaching helped spread devotion to Mary as help of Christians. By tradition, some of the Church's most beloved Marian prayers have also been associated with Bernard's Marian doctrine, although these attributions should be approached with due prudence. Tradition has associated the figure of Saint Bernard, a great devotee of the Virgin, with some of the Church's most beloved Marian prayers, such as the Memorare, known in Spanish by its opening words, Acordaos, remember, and certain invocations from the Salve. Nevertheless, these attributions should be approached with due prudence, distinguishing tradition from historical certainty. The Memorare is a beautiful prayer to the Virgin Mary. It begins by recalling that it has never been heard that anyone who sought her protection, implored her help or pleaded for her intercession, was ever abandoned. It is a prayer of filial trust in the Virgin, expressing the assurance of being heard by her. Tradition has attributed this prayer to Saint Bernard in connection with his ardent Marian devotion and his confidence in the Virgin's intercession. It should be clarified, however, that the attribution of the Memorare to Saint Bernard is traditional but not historically certain. Scholars consider that the prayer in its present form probably dates from after Bernard's time, although it perfectly expresses the spirit of his Marian devotion. In other words, although Bernard may not have been the certain author of this prayer, it reflects his spirit and his confidence in the Virgin so well that tradition has attributed it to him. This attribution should therefore be accepted as tradition, not as a certain historical fact. Similarly, tradition has attributed to Saint Bernard the addition of the final invocations of the Salve, those that acclaim the Virgin as clement, loving and sweet, as well as the authorship or dissemination of other Marian prayers and hymns. Here too prudence is called for, since not all these attributions are historically confirmed. What is certain is that these prayers express the spirit of Bernard's Marian devotion, and that tradition has associated them with his name because of his reputation as a great devotee of the Virgin. The Memorare and the invocations of the Salve Regina, traditionally attributed to Saint Bernard, are therefore prayers that express the spirit of his Marian devotion, even though their attribution to him is not historically certain. They should be received as part of the tradition, while distinguishing that tradition from historical certainty. What matters is that these prayers reflect the filial trust in the Virgin that Bernard taught. Similarly, tradition and art have associated Bernard with a famous legend concerning his devotion to the Virgin, the lactation legend. Among the pious traditions associated with Saint Bernard's Marian devotion, a singular place is occupied by the so-called lactation legend, according to which the Virgin Mary fed Bernard with her milk as a sign of her special favor toward him. This legend should be approached with due prudence, recognizing it as a pious tradition rather than a historical fact. According to this legend, which became widespread in the art and piety of later centuries, the Virgin Mary appeared to Saint Bernard and, as a sign of her motherhood and special favor, allowed a few drops of the milk with which she had nursed the child Jesus to fall upon his lips. Symbolically, the legend expressed the idea that Bernard had received from the Virgin a special grace, heavenly wisdom, and sweetness, as though he had been nourished by the Mother of God. The lactation legend was represented numerous times in Christian art, especially in painting and sculpture from the centuries following Bernard's life. These representations show the Virgin allowing her milk to fall upon the saint in a gesture of maternal favor. The image conveyed, in visual form, the idea of Bernard's special devotion to the Virgin and of the singular grace he had received from her. It is one of the most widespread images in the iconography of Saint Bernard. It is important, however, to be clear that this legend is a pious tradition originating centuries after Bernard, and not an attested historical fact. Its value lies not in its historicity but in its symbolism. It expresses Bernard's special devotion to the Virgin and the idea that his sweet wisdom, that of the mellifluous doctor, was like a gift received from the Mother of God. It should therefore be received for what it is, a pious and symbolic tradition, not history. The lactation legend of Saint Bernard is therefore a pious tradition, widespread in art and devotion, that symbolically expresses the saint's special devotion to the Virgin and the singular grace he had received from her. It should be received as a tradition, not as a historical fact. What matters beyond the legend is Bernard's ardent love for the Virgin, of which the legend is a symbolic expression. And this great mystic and devotee of the Virgin was also a man of action, who placed himself at the service of the Church in the great causes of his time, beginning with the defense of its unity in the face of a serious schism. Although Saint Bernard was a monk who loved silence and a withdrawn life, circumstances called him to intervene in the great affairs of the Church of his time, and he became one of the most influential men in Christendom. One of the great causes to which he devoted his efforts was the defense of the unity of the Church in the face of a serious schism that had divided it, with the election of a legitimate pope and an opposing anti-pope. At that time, following the death of a pope, a double election took place. One group elected a pope, while another elected a rival whom history considers an anti-pope, that is, an illegitimate claimant to the papacy. This double election caused a schism, a division within the Church, as different kingdoms and influential figures supported one or the other, and the unity of the Church was gravely threatened. It was a serious situation that required decisive discernment and intervention. In this grave situation, Saint Bernard, renowned for his holiness and wisdom, was consulted and called upon to intervene. Bernard studied the matter, discerned which of the two claimants was the legitimate pope, and decisively took his side, using all his influence and eloquence to defend his cause and restore the unity of the Church. He travelled through various kingdoms, spoke with kings and influential figures, and succeeded in winning recognition of the legitimate pope from most of Christendom. Bernard's intervention was decisive in ending the schism and restoring the unity of the Church. His prestige, eloquence, and holiness tipped the balance in favour of the legitimate pope and helped bring the schism to an end so that the Church could regain her unity. Bernard thus proved himself a great defender of the unity of the Church, willing to leave the peace of his monastery to serve the Church's cause at a moment of grave need. The defender of unity in the face of the schism and the anti-pope, this is how Saint Bernard showed himself in this grave crisis, using his influence and eloquence to restore the unity of the Church. His intervention was decisive and revealed his love for the Church and his willingness to serve her in times of need. This love for the Church and for truth also led him to intervene in the doctrinal controversies of his time, especially the one he engaged in with a celebrated teacher, Peter Abelard. Another matter in which Saint Bernard intervened, moved by his love for the truth and for the faith of the Church, was the doctrinal controversy with a celebrated teacher of his time named Peter Abelard, one of the most brilliant and controversial thinkers of the period. This controversy, which brought Bernard into conflict with Abelard, is one of the best-known episodes of Bernard's efforts to defend the faith. Abelard was a renowned teacher of great intellect and fame, who applied the methods of reason and dialectic to theology with a boldness that many considered excessive and dangerous to the faith. Some of his teachings were considered erroneous, or at least ambiguous, on important matters of faith and aroused concern within the Church. Attentive to the purity of the faith, Bernard saw some of Abelard's doctrines as a danger to orthodoxy and opposed them. Bernard therefore intervened in this controversy, defending the faith of the Church against what he regarded as errors or dangers in Abelard's teachings. He used his influence and eloquence to ensure that doctrines considered erroneous were examined and, where appropriate, condemned by the authority of the Church. The controversy was resolved through the intervention of ecclesiastical authority, which examined the doctrines in question. According to tradition, Abelard ultimately submitted to the judgment of the Church and was reconciled, spending his final days in peace. This controversy reveals Bernard's zeal for the purity of the faith and his willingness to defend it against what he regarded as errors. Nevertheless, this episode should be approached with balance, recognizing that it was a controversy between two great men with different positions and methods. Bernard represented a monastic theology born of lived faith and contemplation. Abelard, a more rational and dialectical theology. The controversy partly reflects the tension between these two ways of doing theology, in addition to the specific doctrinal issues. Bernard and his controversy with Abelard thus reveal Bernard's zeal for the purity of the Church's faith and his willingness to defend it. This episode should be approached with balance, recognizing the greatness of both men and the complexity of the controversy. What is certain is that Bernard was driven by his love for the faith and the Church. This love for the Church also led him to support and promote a new form of consecrated life in the service of Christendom, that of the Knights Templar. Among the various causes supported by Saint Bernard was that of a new form of consecrated life that arose in his time, that of the Knights Templar, an order of warrior monks devoted to defending pilgrims and the holy places in the Holy Land. Bernard supported this new order and wrote a celebrated treatise in its praise on the new knighthood. The Knights Templar were a religious and military order that arose in the Holy Land. Its members combined religious life with vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, with the military task of defending pilgrims who traveled to the holy places and protecting those places. This was something new in the Church. Monks who were also knights, combining religious consecration with the service of arms in the service of Christendom. Saint Bernard supported this new order and contributed to its recognition and to the drafting of its rule of life. He also wrote a treatise praising the new knighthood, in which he set out the ideal of these warrior monks and contrasted it with worldly knighthood. Worldly knighthood, Bernard said, was often driven by vanity, ambition, and senseless violence, whereas the new knighthood of the Templars placed itself at the service of God and Christendom, uniting the courage of arms with religious consecration. Bernard's position should be understood in the context of his time. In an age when Christendom felt threatened and pilgrims to the Holy Land needed protection, the idea of knights consecrated to defending the holy places and the pilgrims appeared as a noble ideal. Bernard, a man of his time, supported this idea, although today, with the perspective of the centuries, the question of the use of arms may be judged with greater nuance. In any case, Bernard was moved by his love for the Church and for Christendom. The Templars and the praise of the new knighthood thus reveal another aspect of Saint Bernard's activity in the service of the Church and of Christendom in his time. Bernard supported this new form of consecrated life, which was characteristic of his era. It should be understood within its historical context. Alongside these activities, Bernard also served as an advisor to the great figures of the Church, and especially to a pope who had once been his monk, to whom he dedicated one of his most important works. St. Bernard's prestige and holiness made him an advisor to the great figures of the Church, and especially to the popes, some of whom sought his counsel and intercession. One of the popes of that time had even been a monk at Clairvaux, a disciple of Bernard, and the saint dedicated to him one of his most important works on how to exercise the papal ministry. One of the popes of that time, named Eugene III, had been a Cistercian monk and a disciple of Saint Bernard at Clairvaux before being elevated to the papacy. The fact that a former monk of Clairvaux became pope was a sign of Bernard's influence and of the fruitfulness of his work. Far from becoming proud, Bernard continued to serve his former disciple with his counsel, helping him to exercise his lofty ministry well. To this pope, his former disciple Saint Bernard dedicated one of his most important works, a treatise on consideration, that is, on the reflection the pope should undertake about himself and his ministry. In this work, Bernard advises the Pope on how to exercise his ministry, urging him not to become absorbed by temporal and administrative affairs, but to cultivate the interior life, prayer, and reflection on himself, on God, and on his mission. It is a work filled with spiritual wisdom and love for the Church. In this work, Bernard, with the freedom and love of a spiritual father, does not hesitate to warn the Pope of the dangers of his office and to exhort him to humility, the interior life, and fidelity to his mission of a spiritual nature. He reminds him that he is a servant of the church, not its master, and that above all he must care for souls and for the things of God. His treatise is a model of how to advise those who exercise authority with love and freedom, and it continues to be read for its wisdom concerning pastoral ministry. As an advisor to popes and the author of the treatise on consideration addressed to Eugene III, his former disciple, Saint Bernard thus reveals himself as a man of great influence in the Church and of profound spiritual wisdom, placed at the service of those who exercised authority. His work on consideration is a treasure of wisdom concerning pastoral ministry. And this same prestige and influence led him to undertake a mission that would prove painful, preaching the Second Crusade. One of the best known and, at the same time, most painful episodes in the life of Saint Bernard was his preaching of the Second Crusade, the military expedition undertaken by Christendom to defend the Christian kingdoms of the Holy Land. At the Pope's request, Bernard preached this crusade with great fervor, but the expedition ended in failure, which was a great trial and a source of pain for him. At that time, the Christian kingdoms established in the Holy Land after the First Crusade were under threat, and the need was felt for a new expedition to defend them. Because of his prestige and eloquence, the Pope entrusted Saint Bernard with preaching this crusade in order to move the kings and peoples of Christendom to take part in it. Bernard accepted this commission out of obedience to the Pope and love for Christendom, and devoted himself to preaching the crusade with great fervor. Bernard's preaching was highly successful. He traveled through various kingdoms, and through his eloquence and prestige moved numerous kings, nobles, and peoples to take the cross and participate in the expedition. Multitudes answered his call, and a great expedition was organized. The fervor Bernard inspired was extraordinary, and many enlisted, moved by his words. It seemed that the crusade was going to be a great success. However, the expedition ended in painful failure. For various reasons, the Second Crusade did not achieve its objectives, and the expedition resulted in great losses and no success. This failure was a great trial for Bernard, who had preached the crusade with such fervor and who was, in a certain sense, challenged by the outcome. Bernard suffered deeply because of this failure and faced it with humility, acknowledging the inscrutable designs of God and examining the causes of the failure, which he attributed in part to the sins of the participants. The preaching of the Second Crusade and its failure thus reveal a painful episode in the life of Saint Bernard, in which, after great success in preaching, he had to face the trial of the expedition's failure. This episode should be viewed with balance and with the perspective of history, recognizing the complexity of those events and the context of the era. Bernard acted out of obedience and love for Christendom, and faced failure with humility and faith. And after these intense activities, Bernard's life was already drawing to its end. After a life of intense activity in the service of God and the Church, Saint Bernard reached his final years tired and worn out by the labors, penances, and hardships of a life given without reserve. His death, which occurred in the year 1153, crowned a life of holiness, learning, and service to the Church. Bernard's final years were marked by exhaustion and illness, the result of the penances and labors of his entire life. His health, already weakened by the rigors of his youth at Clairvaux, gradually deteriorated. Yet despite his ailments, Bernard never ceased to devote himself to the service of God and the Church, remaining active in governing his order, preaching, and handling the affairs of the Church until the end of his strength. Bernard spent his final days in his beloved monastery of Clairvaux, surrounded by his monks, who revered him as both a father and a saint. There, in the monastery he had founded and which had been the center of his life, he prepared for his definitive encounter with God. His death was peaceful and holy, just as his life had been holy, a gentle passage to the God whom he had loved and served with all his strength. He died in the year 1153, surrounded by the affection and veneration of his monks. At his death, Bernard left behind an immense legacy. A Cistercian order spread throughout Europe, with hundreds of monasteries, a rich spiritual doctrine set forth in his writings, and a profound mark on the church and society of his time, in whose great affairs he had taken part as few men of his era had done. The humble monk of Clairvaux had become one of the most influential figures in Christendom, leaving a legacy that would endure throughout the centuries. The final years and death of Saint Bernard in the year 1153 thus crowned a life of holiness, learning and service to the Church. Tired and worn out by his labors, he died a holy death in his beloved Clairvaux, surrounded by his monks and leaving behind an immense legacy. His reputation for holiness, already great during his lifetime, grew after his death, and the Church would soon officially recognize his sanctity through his canonization, and later honor him with the title of Doctor of the Church. The fame of Saint Bernard's holiness, already great during his lifetime, increased after his death, and the Church soon proceeded to officially recognize his sanctity, and in time to honor him with the title of Doctor of the Church, thereby acknowledging the excellence of his teaching. These recognitions crowned the memory of the great abbot of Clairvaux. Bernard's holiness was recognized by everyone during his lifetime, and after his death, testimonies to his virtue and the favors attributed to his intercession multiplied. After the appropriate examination of his life, virtues, and miracles, the Church proceeded to his canonization, that is, to the solemn declaration of his sanctity. Saint Bernard was canonized in the year 1174, barely 20 years after his death, by Pope Alexander III, which shows the strength of his reputation for holiness. With his canonization, Bernard was entered in the catalogue of the saints and offered for the veneration of the whole Church. His cult spread throughout Christendom, and his feast began to be celebrated. The Cistercian monasteries in particular venerated their great father and teacher with special devotion. The memory of Saint Bernard, great abbot, doctor, and mystic, was thus consecrated by the Church. Centuries later, the Church wished to honor Saint Bernard with an even more distinguished title, reserved for saints whose teaching is notable for its excellence and its usefulness to the whole Church, that of Doctor of the Church. In 1830, Pope Pius VIII declared Saint Bernard a Doctor of the Church, officially recognizing the excellence of his spiritual teaching. With this title, Bernard was presented to the whole Church as a teacher of faith and the spiritual life. The canonization of Saint Bernard in 1174 and his proclamation as a Doctor of the Church in 1830 thus crowned the memory of the great abbot of Clairvaux, recognizing his holiness and the excellence of his teaching. Saint Bernard is venerated as a saint and honored as a Doctor of the Church, a teacher of faith and the spiritual life. His influence, already great during his lifetime, has endured throughout the centuries, leaving a profound mark on the Church. Saint Bernard's influence on the Church has been immense and enduring, extending throughout the centuries and far beyond his own era. His work, teaching, and example have left a profound mark on monastic life, spirituality, theology, and the devotional life of the Church. In the sphere of monastic life, Bernard's influence was decisive. He promoted the Cistercian reform and spread it throughout Europe, renewing monastic life and giving it new splendor. The Cistercian order, shaped by his imprint, has endured throughout the centuries, and later branches and reforms have arisen from it. Bernard is considered one of the great figures in the history of monasticism, and his ideal of monastic life continues to inspire Cistercians today. In the spheres of spirituality and theology, Bernard's influence has been equally great. His teaching on the love of God, His mystical understanding of the encounter with the Word and his sermons on the Song of Songs have nourished the spiritual lives of countless souls and influenced the great masters who came after him. Bernard is considered one of the greatest teachers of Christian mysticism, and his teaching continues to be studied and meditated upon. Great saints and theologians who came after him acknowledged their debt to him. In the sphere of devotion, Bernard's influence has been especially great in Marian devotion. His ardent love for the Virgin, his beautiful Marian teaching, and his celebrated writings on Mary have made a powerful contribution to spreading and nourishing devotion to the Virgin throughout the Church. Bernard is one of the Virgin's great singers, and his influence on Marian piety has endured throughout the centuries. Even the great poet Dante, in his celebrated work, placed the final prayer to the Virgin on the lips of Saint Bernard, thus acknowledging his role as a great devotee of Mary. Saint Bernard's influence on the Church, monastic life, spirituality, theology, and Marian devotion was therefore immense and enduring. His work, doctrine, and example have left a profound mark that has continued through the centuries. Saint Bernard remains a teacher and a model for the Church, and his figure, so rich and influential, still holds a message of great relevance for Christians today. At the end of this journey through the life and work of Saint Bernard, it is fitting to gather the message that his life offers to Christians today. For Saint Bernard is not merely a figure from the past, but a teacher and a model whose doctrine and example remain entirely relevant to believers in our time. The first message of Saint Bernard is the primacy of the love of God. All his doctrine and his entire life were centered on the love of God, which he regarded as the heart of Christian life. In a world that often seeks happiness far from God, Bernard reminds us that man was made to love God, and that only in this love does he find fulfillment. His teaching on the degrees of love invites us to grow in the love of God until we forget ourselves. The second message is the importance of the interior life and prayer. Amid an intense life of service to the Church, Bernard never neglected the interior life, prayer, or union with God, which were the source of all his activity. In an activist and noisy world, Bernard reminds us of the need for the interior life, silence, and prayer, without which action becomes sterile. His life as both a contemplative and a man of action is a model of the union between prayer and service. The third message is devotion to the Virgin Mary. Bernard, a great devotee of the Virgin, teaches us to turn to Mary with filial trust, to look to the star and invoke Mary amid life's trials. In a world filled with difficulties and storms, his invitation to turn to Mary as the guiding star and Mother of Mercy retains all its force. Bernard teaches us that whoever turns to Mary does not perish, but reaches the harbor of salvation safely. The message of Saint Bernard for today is therefore an invitation to place the love of God at the center of our lives, to cultivate the interior life and prayer, and to turn with confidence to the Virgin Mary. His doctrine and example, so rich, remain entirely relevant. May his intercession and teaching help us to love God, to pray, and to turn to the Virgin. And to this great saint, the mellifluous doctor and singer of the Virgin, we address our prayer as we conclude. O glorious Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, mellifluous doctor, last of the fathers of the Church, humble monk and powerful voice of Christendom, lover of God and the Virgin Mary, prostrate before God, we raise our hearts to him through your intercession. You who left behind the honors of the world to consecrate yourself to God in the monastic life, and who drew so many others with you toward Christ, obtain for us the grace to love God above all things, and to seek him with a sincere heart. You who taught the degrees of love and burned with the love of God, imprint that same love upon our hearts. Teach us to love God for his own sake, for his infinite goodness, until we forget ourselves, and to make love the heart of our lives. May we, like you, grow in the love of God. And may that love be the soul of all that we do, uniting prayer and action in one and the same service of God. You who, amid intense activity, never neglected the interior life and union with God, teach us to cultivate silence, prayer, and the interior life, without which action becomes sterile. Grant us a love of prayer and contemplation, and help us to seek God amid our daily occupations, uniting as you did, contemplation and service to the Church and to our brothers and sisters. You, who were the great Cantor of the Virgin Mary, and who taught us to look to the star and invoke Mary in the trials of life, rekindle in us a love for the Virgin. Teach us to turn to her with filial trust in every danger and in every anguish, confident that whoever turns to Mary will not perish, but will reach safely the harbor of salvation. May we, like you, love her as our mother and invoke her as the star who guides us to Christ. Receive, O Saint Bernard, this prayer that we address to you today and present it before the throne of God, together with the Virgin Mary, whom you loved so dearly. Obtain for us the grace to love God, to cultivate the interior life, and to turn with confidence to the Virgin, so that, following your example, we may serve God and the Church with all our strength, and one day come to contemplate the face of God in heaven. In your company and that of all the saints, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, mellifluous doctor and cantor of the Virgin, pray for us. Amen.